So.
Right.
All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody to the University of New Mexico Law and Mental Health Didactic Series, hosted by the University of New Mexico Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences and the New Mexico Behavioral Health Services Division. I'm Dr. Anthony Perillo. I'm the Forensic Psychology Training Director here in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. A couple of things to go over right now for our talk today. Make sure if you have questions to ask them in the Q&A box, not the chat box, the Q&A box. Anytime you feel comfortable, we are going to reserve those questions until the end of the discussion. We'll try to get to as many as we can, but just forgive us if we can't get to yours. If you want continuing education credits but are on a tight schedule, you do have to stay for the full talk, but you don't have to stay longer than the full hour. We'll let you know when the hour is passed. There will be a sign-in sheet for those of you that are going to are pursuing continuing medical education credits, and you'll sign in the chat box. For those of you that are looking for APA psychological continuing education credits, near the end of the talk, there will be a link that's posted. You will need to click that link before you exit this chat, before you exit the talk, and you'll want to save your certificate after you complete the survey there, because we don't keep copies of those. A recording and PowerPoint presentation of this presentation will be available to you in about a week. And as a heads up for next week we will have Dr. Johnny Pirelli presenting on Guns and Clinical Practice, Essentials for Medical and Mental Health Professionals. But you're here today. Now is the time that we've all been waiting for. I'd like us to introduce the speaker for today. Who'll be presenting on reliability, credibility, competence of children's forensic testimony, Dr. Kamala London. Dr. London is a professor of psychology at the University of Toledo in the United States. Her work focuses on using developmental science to improve how children and adolescents are handled in the justice system. She's authored over 40 scientific articles and book chapters in the areas of developmental and forensic psychology. Dr. London has testified as an expert witness for both the prosecution and the defense throughout the United States, in U.S. military court, and abroad. Dr. London was featured in a 2021 Emmy-award winning docuseries on Showtime called Outcry, which highlights the young man who was falsely convicted and later released due to police misconduct. Dr. London, on behalf of the University of New Mexico, can I just say how excited we are to have you join our series, and we're very thankful for you sharing your expertise. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you so you can begin the presentation.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here to talk to everyone. And I was really honored to be invited to come talk. Although full disclosure, I kind of invited myself a little bit, so thought I'd better disclose that. I've been enjoying attending these talks myself, especially since I don't have any other forensic people in my program. And at one point, Dr. Brovko and I were talking or emailing about a separate issue. And I told her, oh, I'd love to give a talk to your group sometime. And her answer was, how about in 3 weeks? So I kind of invited myself, I guess, but also got invited. So I'm really happy to be here and to talk to everyone. I thought I'd start out just saying a little bit about my background. I worked for several years during undergrad at a police department as a police intern, and I took minor police reports. And I also worked in a victim witness unit for the prosecutor, handling restraining orders and helping, show children the courtroom and things like that. And I happened to notice as I was taking my police reports that the way I would ask people questions really seemed to affect the answers or the way that they would answer me and provide information. I also just became fascinated by memory. So although I was planning on going into law, again, memory just became so fascinating to me. When I started at the police department, I was only 19. And so they had me work for the vice unit a little bit. They had me do some alcohol buys because that was back in the day when they were just first cutting, kind of becoming strict about the drinking age and enforcing that. So I did like an alcohol buy at one point with the vice unit. The place I went, the store, sold me alcohol. I get back out into the unmarked car, and the vice officers said to me, "Oh, so they sold to you?" "Yes." "What did the guy look like who sold it to you?" And I was like, my gosh, I have no idea. I was so nervous. I completely don't remember. And they said, "Well, I bet you do remember, was it a man or a woman?" And, we kind of figured it out a bit. But anyway, that led to me deciding to pursue developmental psychology. And ever since, I've been studying how to interview children. When you have maltreated children, what are typical ways that they disclose? And so basically, anything having to do with how we can best handle children in the courtroom, as well as methods that we should avoid. And as Anthony mentioned, I have been giving expert testimony for about the past 20 years. I have testified in civil cases involving, say, lawsuits of, say, an individual against a school, criminal cases, and military cases as well. I did a case in Indonesia that I'd love to talk about sometime. We could spend the whole hour talking about that one. It was kind of like the McMartin of Indonesia, is how it's been described. I've really enjoyed, in some ways, being an expert, because it really has driven many of my research ideas. For example, I published a paper on the use of a something else alternative for forced choice questions. So this is where you would say to the child, were you laying down, sitting up, or something else? And I started seeing that being used a lot by forensic interviewers. And so I became interested in that. I really, my own gut thoughts, based on having 3 kids of my own and being around kids a lot, was that wasn't a good idea, but it was an empirical question. I had seen a pediatric child abuse pediatrician give testimony that when you give the something else alternative, it's akin to an open-ended question. So in fact, I ended up conducting a couple of studies and found out otherwise, that the something, was it over, under, or something else alternative, in fact, does not lead to any better of performance than just asking them the 2 forced choice questions. So anyway, that's the kind of thing I became quite interested in. And I'm going to talk to you then today about what can you do as an expert in these child witness or cases involving children or adolescents, or sometimes even adults who are alleging events during childhood. When I consult on cases, I often find that some attorneys have done lots of cases with child witnesses. Other attorneys really never have. They've got all kinds of different specialties. And so I often spend the first bit of time with them explaining, at least as I see it, what is the difference between reliability, credibility, and competence as it pertains to child witnesses, and really how I look at cases, what I'm able to look at and not look at in each of those 3 domains. I'm going to touch just briefly on evidence-based practices in interviewing children, and I'll talk to you about some legal examples as well. So I know that some of you are already experts or training in child witnesses. I wanted just to give you a glimpse of what I tend to see in the child sexual abuse cases that I work on. Now, most of the principles that we have to talk about, like with regard to memory and interviewing, they pertain to any child that you're interviewing, whether you're interviewing them about child sexual abuse, physical abuse, homicide, whatever. But the big thing I'm going to talk to you about today is when people develop a suspicion of abuse, of sexual abuse, because I tend to see that specifically in the area of sexual abuse. And I think also a lot of developmental researchers like myself have talked a lot about sexual abuse rather than say physical abuse or neglect. We do talk about sexual abuse a lot, even though it's the least prevalent of the different types of abuse, because of the phenomenology, because of the fact that there tends not to be corroborative evidence, because there can often be long delays in between when this alleged event took place and then somebody finding out about it and the child coming before authorities. Often too, the child's had multiple interviews with not just then with a forensic interviewer, but with people, potentially their teacher, their principal, Department of Human Services, with therapists, or what I refer to as informal interviews or informal conversations. Those could be with anyone, with a parent, with a grandparent, an uncle, a peer, and so forth. And so I think the nature of sexual abuse cases is they're just, I feel like such difficult cases to investigate, given those characteristics that I just went over. And yet they're also very high stakes. And so I thought I'd give you a few examples of cases that I've worked on, just to illustrate how high stakes these cases are. I'm working on several death penalty appeals cases right now. One example is a case that I have been working on where the individual is on death row due to a double homicide. An intruder entered the family residence one night and killed the mother and the sister. And the only surviving witness was a child. Now, in that case, I think it is quite interesting that the man who now is on death row, he actually was tried 3 times before he was convicted. The first 2 trials were hung juries, with a majority voting for acquittal. And it was not until the 3rd trial that he was convicted. It presents a lot of interesting issues with child witness that witnesses that case, because at first, when the child was interviewed, he basically just said that he was sleeping in the same bed as his mom, and when the intruder came in, he hid behind the bed and didn't see anything. It became evident at some point that the child primarily spoke Spanish, but yet he was interviewed in English. And then also he was around his family members before he was interviewed. And so he talked to the, uncle and other relatives about, we don't know what, about them, trying to figure out who could have done that. The child, again, at first said he was hiding behind the bed and didn't really see anything. By the time the 3rd trial came along, he was giving an account that sounded to me like a movie, like Home Alone or something, where he was claiming basically he chased the guy out into the driveway and he slipped on a banana peel, basically. So in that case, the person still is on death row, attempting appeals. Another case example I'll give you, I call the case of the intoxicated police officer, illustrates a case that I reviewed and then I ended up not testifying. And that happens quite a bit for me, where I'll review the case file I don't see anything that's concerning, and the child's statement appears to be relatively spontaneous. So I turn it away. They don't want me to testify for the defense if my view isn't favorable to them. But in that case, it involved a 10-year-old girl who was staying the weekend with her father. Her parents were divorced. When mom picks the child up on Monday to take the child to school, the child ends up started crying in the car and said that dad had gotten really drunk on Saturday night and came into her room in the middle of the night and sexually assaulted her. Mom and dad had had a pretty good relationship. Mom was quite shocked. Mom, said, at least according to mom's report of what she said, she claimed that she said, are you sure? She was shocked. And then she took the child right to the hospital at that point. One thing that is difficult in these cases, at least I find, is that at the hospitals, they rarely record their interviews with children, even though they do conduct interviews along with the physical exam. But at least in the notes from the hospital, I didn't really see anything of concern that stood out from the interview. And then the forensic interview itself was pretty good. And so for me, I really had nothing to add in that case. And in fact, the individual ended up being convicted. And because he had gone in on like 2 different occasions over the weekend and had assaulted his daughter, he was sentenced to life with no chance of parole because that's the sentence in his state. Contrast that with a God's messenger case. This is a case quite different where basically mom, it was a very religious family. The mom and the grandmother felt that they had like the power to talk to God, like kind of this divine power where God would send them messages. And it's a long, and they're usually long and convoluted stories, but I'll just say this much. Mom was very controlling of dad, according to witnesses, not just dad and old boyfriends as well. Mom, at one point, allegedly had a vision from God that along her husband's way home from work, he had coveted a woman in a yellow car. And when he got home, mom allegedly headbutted him for coveting another woman. She was not there, but she had a vision of this, again, that he had like coveted a woman on his way home from work at a red light or something like that. So they end up having a couple of kids. At age 12 months, so they have a 12-month-old daughter. The grandmother became concerned that the dad was sexually abusing the little girl because allegedly during a diaper change, the little girl kind of ended up touching her genital area when the diaper came off and said, "Dada." And grandmother felt that the little girl was disclosing sexual abuse. Of course, as an expert in that case, I pointed out that I didn't think it was possible that a 12-month-old was trying to convey that, because they wouldn't have known that that was even something that needed conveying. And she could have been just uttering syllables, and dada is a pretty common phoneme that babies utter. But at any rate, when the child eventually turned age 3, grandma felt, based on the way dad was looking at his little girl when she came down in her princess costume, that something weird was up, and proceeded to question the kid for quite some time, until eventually the kid made an allegation. And again, long story in that case, but the guy in that case did in fact end up getting convicted and sentenced to life with no parole as well, so natural life. So In that case, yeah, and in really any of these cases, often we don't know what really happened because, well, if there's DNA evidence in the case of a homicide, that can be quite compelling. But in the case with, the grandmother who suspected abuse when the 12-month-old said "dada," and kids, if you've had kids or you've changed diapers, pretty much their hands do go to their private parts when the diaper comes off, right? It seems like a tragedy to take a dad away and to sentence someone to life with no parole. Of course, I suppose at the end of the day, though, the question always is, could the person have done anything? So I've seen a lot of, I guess, really, messy cases, and it can be quite complicated. And so I thought I'd start out by talking about how I conceptualize cases and the different areas that attorneys have asked me to focus and to give testimony on, and things that I can and cannot do. And so credibility, this slide and these definitions come from a paper that I wrote with Steve Cece in 2012. And we defined credibility, the credibility of, say, a child or an adult for that matter. We look at how detailed is someone's report. Is a report consistent with kids and abuse claims? Are they giving sexual details? Do they have motive for deception? Does it seem plausible? All the normal things that you would do in any case, whether it be a child witness or not a child. The problem, though, is that we don't have any good tools that have really good success rates in identifying truth tellers from liars, or for that matter, if a child is suggestively interviewed, their reports can look quite detailed and quite consistent. And just because something is plausible doesn't make it true. Think about it. If I told you that I took a spaceship to work today to get here, it's completely implausible. And you can reject that and say it's probably not true. If I told you I took a red Toyota to get here to work today, that's plausible. Seems like it could be true. It is plausible, but it's not true. I don't drive a red Toyota, right? So we can reject things that are fantastical at times, but simply because statements are plausible certainly does not make them true. So credibility really, for the most part, is the domain of the jurors. It's up for the fact finders to weigh the witness's credibility. Competence, I haven't given much testimony on. Ultimately, the judge is the gatekeeper to decide on competence. Zoe Klemfus and Steve Cece wrote an article on competence and competence assessment. And that would be, to what extent do kids have the cognitive ability to encode and recall their experienced events? And if anyone's looking for a dissertation idea, there are no good standardized instruments that judges use to establish competence. It's kind of a free-for-all. Reliability, on the other hand, is something that I think experts in my area give testimony on. And that's what I'm going to talk to you for the rest of this time that we have. Reliability is the context under which a child's allegations come out. And you could think of it a bit like, imagine that you have a murder suspect who's being interviewed. You can look and see, if you have this murder suspect, were they interviewed in a way that, regardless of whether they did or didn't do anything, it's likely, if you beat them or waterboard them, that they're going to confess to something. Similarly with children, to what extent did they come forward and give a report in a way that we know leads to accurate reports versus in a way that we know distorts reports? That's what reliability is all about. And my timeline isn't a typo. I really wanted to emphasize a timeline for people who work or are going to work on these sorts of cases. What I do is I make this timeline of everyone who may have spoken with the child from the time of the alleged events in question until the present. And so I map out any interviews and therapy sessions and basically try to recreate the unfolding of the child's statements. To what extent did they come out like the intoxicated police officer case, where it seemed to be relatively spontaneous and in that child's own words, versus to what extent did certain people have beliefs about what they think took place, and gradually over time, they little by little, possibly with suggestive techniques, ended up eliciting a report from the child. So I'll talk to you about how I conceptualize cases. And if you've seen me give a talk before, I use this slide a lot, not just because I'm lazy or don't have time, but I find this really useful in talking to attorneys and explaining what I can do. And I also find this slide helpful for me to conceptualize the different areas of research. And so what we have then here is, say, it's a bit of an oversimplification, but say abuse happened or abuse did not happen. Now, it could be abuse, it could be a homicide, again, but for the sake of, we're just going to simplify here. Abuse happened or abuse did not happen. I sometimes have attorneys call me and they want me to watch an interview or watch a home video of a dad with the kid and to say, did abuse happen or did it not happen? Now, that's the ultimate question, the ultimate issue that is up to the fact finders. And in fact, what I'm going to try to show you based on the research is that we have to go from the bottom up. Until we get a crystal ball, or unless we have video, we don't know if abuse happened or abuse didn't happen. So underneath each of those two possibilities, we have two possibilities, either that the child tells or that the child does not tell. And so if you take the abuse happened scenario and the child tells, the research here would be research like Carol Peterson's or Jody Quast, Gail Goodman, and others. When abuse did happen, to what extent can children remember it? To what extent do they come forward? What are the best ways to question them in order to get them to make an accurate and complete account? And then we also have this abuse happened, child does not tell. So to what extent, these two different options, to what extent do kids come forward and tell versus not tell? And then on the abuse did not happen side, of course, most kids are not abused and they don't tell. Why would they tell? But I'm going to talk to you today about this next scenario in just a moment. This does not tell, or I'm sorry, the child does not tell scenario, and how we can move backwards into thinking about, does it seem that this child's allegation came about in a way that's reliable versus unreliable? So at the end of the talk, I'll focus back in a little bit on like proper forensic interviewing techniques. But for right now, then I want to focus in on this child does not tell part. So the first question, unless you've worked on these cases, the first question you're probably asking yourself is, if the child doesn't tell, then how do you know anything, and why do you, what can you do? And so that's what I'll talk to you about, because the cases that I see, that I find, are very problematic. And I try not to get emotionally invested in cases. I try to be as neutral as I can. I try to be unbiased, but I am a human being. And there are certain cases I've seen and worked on that do keep me up at night. So the one theme that the cases that I find to be really problematic, the one thing that they share is that usually the child is not the one who first broaches the topic of abuse, but rather that the adult, often their parent, or it could be a teacher or whomever, um, felt that based on signs the child is showing that this child was abused. And so I'd like to talk to you a little bit then about to what extent can adults accurately recognize non-disclosing abuse versus non-abused children? And also, what are lay people's beliefs about being able to do this? What are their sources of knowledge? And so this slide shows you reasons that I have seen in actual cases that I have been involved in that have been seen as red flags, that have led parents to either bring their child in for a forensic interview or to bring their child to therapy in order to get to the bottom of what happened. So I see a different pattern in young kids versus in older kids and adolescents. So for young kids, and there I'm talking maybe up until ages 6 or 7, preschoolers, touching the private parts, that really is the number one thing. I've seen many cases. I've talked to some colleagues in other countries like Finland, Sweden, tell me this isn't really an issue where they're at because nudity, or the fact that a 4-year-old would touch her private parts in the bathtub is seen as quite normal. I think that's seen as normal among many families that, a 3 or 4-year-old is going to touch their private parts. But I've seen many cases that have started because a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old touched their private parts in the bathtub, and the parent asks them, "Why are you doing that?" And they think it's problematic. Kids do that, right? Regardless of abuse history. But sometimes that can start the whole ball rolling. That can start, well, I went and talked to my minister, and my minister said to talk to his wife, and my wife said to take him to therapy, and the therapist, will get to the bottom of it. So not just touching one's own private parts, sometimes more serious sexual behavior, like, licking the private parts of another child or some kind of behavior like that can also launch questioning. Bedwetting is another biggie that I've seen a lot. The 3 or 4-year-old is wetting the bed. And I'm going to talk in a moment about the validity of these in assessing abuse. So if you're thinking like, wait a second, every kid I had, and me as well, we wet the bed till we were 10. Bedwetting is very genetic, but it's still seen as a red flag in a lot of the cases that I've seen, not just by parents, but by like professionals as well. I had one case where the therapist took the child for a walk. A lot of times in therapy, I'll see with little kids that the therapist will say, I want you to pretend that this dinosaur is you and this dinosaur is your dad. And of course, they take, look, it's boys, I can say for sure, take the dinosaurs and start fighting and stuff. And, pretend this is dad, pretend this is you. In one case, the therapist took the child out for a walk near a pond, handed the kid a rock, and told the child, pretend this rock is your dad. And the child threw the rock into the pond. And that was seen as a sign of, I don't know, I guess, bad feelings towards her dad. Even though I don't know how anyone could be, near a pond with a rock and not throw it in. But nonetheless, again, it was written in the report as hey, we're starting to get out information from this reticent child. So I think I've seen that a lot in therapy, that, moms may bring their child to therapy. And again, I know I work on weird cases, so I should mention there are all too many valid cases of abuse. I'm talking about right now a specific form of them. I'm talking about the ones where kids are not saying anything at first, and adults develop the concern or suspicion, right? Fear of loud noises was in another case that I saw. In one case, a person was making a mandated report of potential abuse because they were afraid of the sound of a toilet flushing. This involved a 4-year-old, and the toilet was at school. And those toilets can be really loud if you've, ever taken note of that. In another case, they found it disturbing that the child was afraid of loud sneezes. I also, as a developmental psychologist, of a 3 and 4-year-old, I didn't find that surprising. And so I looked up the weird things I do in my cases. I looked up how loud sneezes can be. And like some people sneeze as loud, like comparison in decibels as like an airplane taking off for a moment. So as a developmental psychologist, I didn't find it unusual. Kids often are afraid of loud noises. I see regressive behavior often being cited, and then just behavioral issues across the board. Hey, kids starting to have temper tantrums. In adolescence, recently I was exposed to a case where the therapist, well, let me just go back a bit. Mom takes kid to therapy because mom and dad are divorcing, and mom just wants to be proactive, and she decides to take her kid to therapy because dad's not very involved and wants to make sure her kid gets through the divorce okay. And after the initial session, the therapist comes out and tells mom, I have disturbing news to tell you. I think your daughter has been being sexually abused by your soon-to-be ex. And of course, mom's life pretty much was swept out from under her feet at that moment, asking the therapist, why do you think that? Or what did she tell you? And the therapist said, no, it was because she wouldn't take her coat off during the therapy session. And I find that to be typical in the kids who've been sexually abused because they want to kind of cover themselves and hide. Other behavioral issues, the biggest that I see in cases where the kid ends up, they've not made any disclosures of abuse, they get sent to therapy, involves when the kid kind of goes off the rail, they develop anxiety, depression, they become withdrawn, they're not doing so well in school, suicidal ideation, self-injurious behavior, especially, I think, in families that certain people dub them like, hey, that's a really good family. Mom and dad are intact. They're not divorced, or they go to church every Sunday. They've got 4 kids. Their 3 kids were great. This kid was great. And now all of a sudden she's got all kinds of problems. There's just no good explanation. Why would she be showing self-injurious behavior? Perhaps she has a repressed memory. Perhaps something happened to her when she was young. And I've seen all numerous now cases that involve that phenomenology, where then they send the kid to therapy, and you'll see the therapist saying, like, your symptoms sound very consistent with what I see in abuse cases. So these are the kinds of red flags that I'm seeing. Again, we're not talking about the child telling side. This is when the child is not telling, and then one of the family members or adults develops concerns based on some of these behaviors. So of course, the problem when you have a behavior like bedwetting, and then you decide to send the kid to therapy, or you keep questioning them as the parent, is that some of the questioning techniques that you use could get where abuse didn't happen, the child's not telling, abuse happened, the child is not telling. Those forceful, repeated interviews can lead to this happening. The abuse did not happen, but in fact, the child tells. I want to go through that and elaborate on that a little bit more. So for us to think about, to what extent might we have the abuse did not happen, but the kid is telling? And to what extent do we have the child isn't telling because they're afraid or reluctant, we need to consider several things. One thing that we need to consider is among kids who really were abused, to what extent do they tend to come forward and tell others? To what extent do they delay? Do they deny? Do they recant? I've written extensively and have conducted research on this issue. And we're talking about sexual abuse, by the way, here. Physical abuse, a colleague and I, Quincy Miller, and I deal with physical abuse in this Miller in London 2020 publication. But talking about sexual abuse specifically right now, we know that many kids actually tell somebody relatively quickly, according to more recent surveys of younger folks, like not surveys of people my age, but people who are like in their teens or 20s. They often tell friends, but nonetheless, many still don't tell anyone. But most cases fly under the radar. So the best estimate of cases that make it to authorities is only about 10 to 15% of child sexual abuse cases. So again, it seems that kids are talking about it more, and that's probably not surprising to you. But nonetheless, again, most of the cases don't reach authorities. I have argued that among those that do, among cases that do come before authorities, most of them are telling. That's what gets them there. And so once in a while, a kid might go to the CAC center without having a prior disclosure. Let's say if a sibling, they found out the sibling was abused, or a friend, or whatever. But for most kids, they're already telling and they continue to tell. And so despite what has been written in the past, like with Roland Summit's child sexual abuse combination syndrome, denials and recantations during formal assessment, in fact, are not the norm, but rather, again, most are telling. And I want to walk you through now an example of where I think it illustrates that we should be concerned about false cases in forensic interviews. So this slide also pertains to sexual abuse cases that come before authorities. I was once asked on the witness stand, do you think that non-disclosure, i.e. an abused kid who doesn't come forward, is that a bigger problem, or are there more of them? Or are there more of kids making false allegations? And clearly, there's more of the kids not coming forward who really were abused. That is true. But as I thought that through later, I want to just draw your attention to the right-hand part of this slide, and then I'm going to walk you through this scenario. So I'll just quickly mention, we don't know a whole lot about the number of kids who were not abused who come before authorities. We don't know much about that, about those rates. Julia Corkman published a study on it. But suffice it to say, kids who were not abused sometimes come before authorities, sexual behavior, self-injury, or whatever. In order to come up with base rates of, to what extent are denials a problem in forensic interviews, and how do we make sense of denials, and are denials likely abused kids who are denying, or might they be valid denials? We need to know rates of abuse, and we need to know rates of disclosure. So here are some of the citations that I relied upon with this hypothetical example. This is a hypothetical example. I'm using kind of what I think are the best estimates, but we could plug in lots of different things to this general, I guess the general message that I am trying to convey here. So I want to walk you through this kind of step by step. And what my point is going to be is that even if there are relatively low rates of false concerns, right? so moms or dads being worried that their kid was abused when they weren't, that would still result in a lot of the denials during forensic interviews coming from truly non-abused kids, if you look at the base rates. So to try to make this concrete, I want you to imagine we have 1,000 kids. I'm going to say, let's say a 10% abuse rate. Now, actually, if you look to the rates of David Finkelhor, I don't know if you have thoughts on, like, has abuse gone up? Has it gone down over the years? Sexual abuse rates actually have gone down. And so we could plug in different rates according to how old is the kid, is it male or female? For the sake of simplicity, imagine a 10% abuse rate. That's going to result in 100 abused kids. About 15% come to authorities. And let's imagine that 13 out of 15 disclose and that we get 2 denials. We're going to have 900 non-abused kids. If we had just 1% of them make their way to authorities because they're touching their private parts or whatever, that would result in 9 kids coming before authorities. And if just less than half of them ended up disclosing, say they've been suggestively interviewed by their parent beforehand, in this hypothetical example, what you can see, because of the base rate of abuse, is that we would still have a majority of the denials during formal assessment coming from the actual valid denials. So the big message for me here that I'm trying to convey is that we need to stay open-minded. I think false denials really are something that we see. And you know what, if it wasn't something that we would be concerned about, we wouldn't even need interviews, right? I mean, obviously we can have false concerns about things. Why? I'm going to talk about the why a little bit and then kind of give some closing thoughts and open things up for discussion. Human cognition is fallible. You have to keep in mind that the CAC or the DHS or the therapist generally is hearing from one party. Let's say if it's a divorce case, which I think I've seen those be particularly problematic. And let's say you're shown drawings like this from a mom that says, I recently underwent a divorce and I'm worried because my kids got like swords and we can see all these penis-like things and semen and, that the interpretation of behaviors that can be completely normal can be affected by that context. Edil Dor, Saul Kasson, and their colleagues, they have shown that the way we interpret things, whether you see this 12, 13, or 14, or are you primed to see A, B, and C, is going to be affected by your thoughts going into it, basically. And so these drawings, actually were from one of my sons. They tend to go through these phases in their drawing where everything, kind of in a way looks like a bit of a phallic symbol. But when I questioned my son of what that was, he said it was Spider-Man, right? But we just have to be careful. I don't mean to insult or indict parents. These actually are my 3 boys. I think for the most part, when a parent does end up putting their kid, into therapy and having these worries about abuse, that it's because we do love them and we'll do almost anything to keep them safe. But unfortunately, we may not be aware that many of these things are actually quite normal. So I'll just say this much. Many abused kids don't show signs. Many kids show the same signs for reasons outside of abuse. And again, the big problem that I see, the issue in problematic cases, comes from when individuals believe the kid was abused and the kid won't tell, and they think the kid was reluctant, and they try to they basically pursue the kid until eventually the kid discloses. So let's see, I want to show you just a couple quick things and then I'll close it out. Thank you to my grad student, Riley Grady. She did this exploration of TikTok. We've been seeing a tremendous increase in repressed memory cases and an increase in beliefs in repressed memory. And so we looked at how many views per hashtag certain topics had. Billie Eilish came out with Tourette's, EMDR therapy, trauma. It's not just say parents or peers or therapists who can influence kids, but especially teens or the parents can be influenced by social media. There's a book out right now that has about 57,000 reviews on Amazon just for the soft cover alone, called The Body Keeps the Score. And so we've got all kinds of I guess just reasons, this huge resurgence of people who are making claims of repression. I have to take my headphones off for a second. I want to show you this video, and then I'll close out, like I said, and open it up for discussion. Perfect opportunity. I wanted to show you an interview with a 3-year-old, so I questioned my kid this morning about his Halloween experience. Hopefully, you can hear this, hopefully. Yeah.
Hey, was it Halloween?
Yeah.
It was? Did you go trick-or-treating?
Yeah.
What did you get when you trick-or-treated? What do people give you?
Candy.
What kind of candy? Was it chocolate?
It wasn't chocolate. What's candy?
Candy? What did you dress up as?
Batman.
You did? What else did you do when you trick-or-treated?
Trick-or-treated. Trick-or-treated.
What do you say? Do you knock on a door?
Yeah.
And what do you say?
Trick-or-treat.
Yep.
Candy.
Candy. Give me a candy, please. And was it cold or was it warm when you trick-or-treated? Was it cold and it kind of rained? Brr. Did you say, you remember that? Brr, I'm freezing.
I read it too.
I'm curious as to your thoughts about that interview. So I think for the sake of time and that I want to have time for discussion and questions, I want to just mention that in the current issue of JARMAC, the Journal of Applied Research in Memory and Cognition, my colleague Gab Principe, who has been a major person in the world who's been studying mothers and parents' influence on their children, that we have a special, like a target issue in the current JARMAC issue, and there are several commentaries as well. So if this is a topic that interests you, I'll refer you to that issue. But the bottom line is that when parents hold false beliefs, these highly directive questions with their children, that those questioning methods have downstream effects. And in our work, at least, kids, especially young kids, tend not to recognize or recall suggestive influence. Monica Lawson's work has found that as well. And so evaluate or think about, with the interview you just saw of my then 3-year-old, did he seem believable? My questions, were they normal for a parent to ask? They seem like normal, the normal way a parent would ask their kid questions versus a forensic interviewer, how a forensic interviewer should. And then I want to tell you that I actually took that video before Halloween, not after Halloween, And when I took the video, he had never trick-or-treated, right? Never. He'd never in his life trick-or-treated until that year. But we had talked about trick-or-treating, and we had talked about that you were going to say trick-or-treat, and he was going to dress up as Batman, right? And so it just shows us the importance, right? I think in staying open-minded as professionals who work with children, and realizing, you know, that we can have, again, not just parents, but you can look to lobotomies or things that we used to say were good to give babies. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup that contained cannabis and morphine and things like that, to say it's not just parents, but in fact, we sometimes have maybe ideas that are not so good. So I keep saying I'll end and open up to questions. I want to show you this and then open up to questions for real. This is what happens when we ignore base rates, I think, and consider bedwetting, for example, to be indicative or probative of abuse. This is an actual case that I worked on. This is the actual testimony on the left-hand panel, where a SANE nurse testified that she found the fact that this 3-year-old was bedwetting as indicative, as a red flag of abuse. Under cross-examination, she was asked, are you aware that about half of 3-year-olds have nighttime enuresis? Does that affect your view about bedwetting being indicative of abuse? And her response was, unfortunately, my scope is within the realm of sexual abuse disclosure. All right, I'm going to put this up. Maybe we can talk about it. I'm breaking down in this slide. If we take into account rates of abuse and rates of enuresis, just like what I showed you a moment ago, the majority of bedwetters are not going to be coming from the abuse group when we take into consideration the base rates of abuse. So these were issues that I wanted to raise and kind of get people thinking about reasons that cases that are invalid can come to the attention of authorities. And I think this is probably a good time then to open things up for question and discussion. Thank you very much for joining and for your attention. I really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Linden. There's a lot here that we have.
I know, I always feel like the time goes way too fast.
It always does, right? Not enough time. Well, we have enough questions here, plenty of questions and more coming in as I speak right now to be able to talk further about these issues. So one thing I see here is we have one question about if a child is asked a suggestive or leading question, does that uniformly lead to the child giving false information? Meaning, if a child is asked a leading question and they make a mistake about a particular detail, would that invalidate the other information the child later provides?
And that's a great question and a complex one. So just because a leading question is asked doesn't necessarily mean the kid is giving false information. Like, you could waterboard someone because you think they were a terrorist and they confess that they were a terrorist, and maybe they really were a terrorist, but because they were waterboarded, you can't trust their confession, right? I go, my own personal standard of reviewing interviews and suggestive influence is called a good enough. It's a good enough interview. I don't expect perfection. I don't think just one question is enough. As an expert, that would probably be a case that I turn away. But I think if you just ask one question, like, you know, has your finger ever got caught in a mouse trap? That, you know, and you ask that question repeatedly, pretty soon it's going to start to seem familiar and plausible. You're going to get false alarms, and then kids tend to elaborate and they come up with details. So that's the dangerous part. Like what you just saw in the video of my middle child, Cole, when I said things that he didn't even know about, right? Like, I don't know, he was like confabulating details, even though he had never trick-or-treated before. So I think that's the danger. But yeah, one suggestive question, although you have to be careful, like, where is it placed? Like, if it's placed to break the kid, to get them to start talking about private part touching by dad when they hadn't previously said anything, I would find perhaps one leading question concerning. And then it depends who's telling me. Is it recorded, or is it the therapist or the parent saying that they didn't ask any leading questions? So that's a whole nother kind of can of worms that Gab Principe and I review in our paper. Is in an informal setting or in therapy where you're not video recording, how well can adults and children actually accurately recollect the dynamics of that conversation? The answer is not well, in terms of the specific question and answer pairs.
So sort of jumping off that last part where you reference, we're talking primarily about children, but some people have questions about children's memories and reports relative to adults. So we have one question here asking about, in what ways are children's reports, or in what ways can children's reports be more reliable and valid than the adult's report?
Yeah, I think that's another great question that we know. I think all things held equal, young children, preschoolers are going to be more apt to agree with a suggestion, or a suggestion that might be harder to get an adult to acquiesce to. But once you have convinced the adult or adolescent that some false event took place, the adolescent and adult they have a lot more to draw on to confabulate. And in fact, that's what many people, Chuck Brainerd, Gab Principe as well, found that the older kids can elaborate a lot more than the little kids because they have more to draw on. And so I think it's a topic that really needs research. So topics that need research are like memory for conversations and how to get good reports from people about the nature of the conversations. But yeah, there's all kinds of important research questions too, like developmental reversals. And Henry Ogar has published a bit on that. What kinds of circumstances and factors might lead younger kids to actually give like better testimony or to be more resistant? Yeah, it's a great point.
What does the literature say about the development of long-term autobiographical memory for young children? So when the disclosure is not contemporaneous, which is common in family law sex abuse allegations, is there a scientific foundation for, say, a 6 or 7-year-old being able to newly disclose a specific memory from a much earlier period without adult input?
Another great question. My suggestion would be to read up Monica Lawson. Carol Peterson has published quite a bit on children's memory for traumatic events. My understanding of that, Robin Fivish, many others, is that kids encode what they can make sense of at the time, right? So basically, if you have a 2 or a 3-year-old who experienced something, you shouldn't have them at age, let's say they end up making a disclosure at 15. They shouldn't be reporting things like, hey, the rhododendrons were in bloom. Because how could a 2 or 3-year-old even know what a rhododendron was to even encode in the first place? So there's a minimum cutoff. Carol Peterson actually has been writing quite a bit lately about infantile amnesia and how kids' earliest memories are earlier than adults' earliest memories. But basically, whatever language level that we were at the time of the event, is pretty equivalent to what we could have encoded for one. And so that really does get quite tricky, and it does start to go into the domain of competence, and again, I've given expert testimony about competence, but mainly I stick to reliability, but lots of research still needed.
Absolutely. We do have one person asked in reference to the McMartin preschool case, of course, that had a number of children making a lot of different statements and allegations. And the question comes to, how can these instances of leading questions ultimately be avoided? Are there particularly strong recommendations for avoiding leading questions by family or even investigators?
So I mentioned a couple things, not to try to promote my own work here, but about a year ago, I filmed a little documentary on investigation discovery that deals specifically with the McMartin case, and Ray Buckey gave audio interview in that. So if anyone's interested in checking out McMartin, and I'm actually filming in about a month a new documentary I'm gonna do an interview for the documentary that's going to be coming out on McMartin and then those satanic ritualistic abuse cases that were rampant in the 80s and 90s that seem to be invalid. What can we do? Gab Principe and I made some recommendations in that paper that we just wrote that I told you about, that Target article in JARMAC. We recommend that, for example, police officers recommend to the parent, don't question or talk to your kid about this, try to do the interview as soon as possible. There's so many different things. I would love to I'm gonna invite myself a second time. I'd love to come back and have a whole nother talk on or even just discussion on what are some of the things that we could do. I think looking to the work by people like Edil Dorr, who is coming up with really great ways of kind of transforming forensic science to reduce bias, that we need to do some of those things as well. Right now, my biggest worry and concern really is parents and therapists, more so than forensic interviewers. And the fact that therapy sessions aren't recorded. So what can we do? I hope that we can get a public message campaign or something out there to parents that hey, just because your kid touched their private part or they're engaging in self-injury doesn't mean they were abused. You got to be careful, right? But right now, I don't think that message is getting out there. I think quite the opposite. And some recent data from my lab, in fact, with my grad student, Quincy Miller, we're finding that people are really overestimating the rates of abuse and really overestimating the likelihood a kid was abused based on showing behaviors like self-injury. And so my email address is available just with a Google search. I have it at the end of these slides as well. And if anyone would like more info on any of the topics that I got to, I don't know how I feel like this hour just flew by so quickly, but I'd be very happy to send you more information or to continue dialogue. I would love to hear what people think we could do to help lessen this problem.
Certainly, we'll make sure that people have the access to those slides available, and I'll definitely bookmark for a follow-up presentation with you sometime later on. I'll try to squeeze in one or two more questions here. One question here is, what's been your experience with the effects of the context of the forensic evaluation and race in assessments of credibility of child witnesses?
Yeah, such great questions. There hasn't been that much research. about like race and assessments of credibility with child witnesses, to my knowledge. And I think it's a really important issue. And, you know, I guess I thought I had a 3-hour talk, or I rambled too much at the beginning, because I did want to touch on issues regarding age, cultural differences, racial differences, SES, history of maltreatment, intellectual disabilities. If somebody has a first language, what do we do with that? You know, they're very complex issues. I will say, like, for the most part, there's not much out there saying that like race necessarily makes the difference, but I think most studies are underpowered with like diversity in the sample to even detect that. And yeah, there's a literature on cultural differences producing differences in autobiographical memory by folks like Key Wang. But I think all I can say on that one is I think we need more research on that topic. I wish I could give a better answer.
Certainly, yeah, more research needed certainly in a number of different domains for child interviewing and credibility assessments. One last question I'll bring up here is more on the idea of experts themselves. The context here, it's sometimes frustrating to see that we have knowledge empirically, but by choosing a faulty expert or somebody that doesn't understand the research, we risk throwing out the baby with the bathwater, that the field is seen as unreliable. Any suggestions for guidelines on the topic of expert qualifications?
I empathize. I see that. And it's not just the expert. Like some of the things that I still see interviewers or therapists doing with kids, and I know my grad students, you know, feel the same way. It is so frustrating to see a kid go into an interview. The interviewer says to them, like, tell me about it. The kid starts giving this great narrative, and then the interviewer like cuts them off and starts saying, were you on the bed or off the bed? You know, and doesn't let the kid talk. Like, that's quite maddening in and of itself. But yeah, like, I guess, you know, good point about what experts testify on. You know, there are rules, and I apologize, I didn't get to all my slides. I know I have a slide in here somewhere, yeah, about admissibility criterion. I would, can I come back a third time after that one? I mean, no, I really would love to have a more dialogue or a workshop at a conference where we try to come up with what our experts should say and what they should avoid, because it really kind of just seems like the Wild West out there. And the judge is the gatekeeper about expert testimony. And so I just see the craziest stuff get testified to. And that it usually goes unchallenged as well. Like that whole bedwetting thing, you know, with this saying that bedwetting's probative of abuse in a 3-year-old, and that was her testimony. My own personal thing that I do to try to keep my bias in check is I try to approach every case with an open mind, knowing I'm human and humans are fallible and biased. I try to imagine that the kids in the case were my kids. And if those were my kids, what would I want that expert to be doing? And how would I want them to comport myself? And like, that's how, like, I try to just be so like fair and honest by, again, imagining if those were my children, what would I want that expert to be doing? So I have like little kind of tricks that I've developed over the years as an expert, but you know, there's really not much training out there on how to become an expert. And that's just like my own moral code, right? But yeah, I really think it's kind of the Wild West, at least when it comes to children and testimony that's given about children.
It's
I'd
such a
love to
double-edged
talk more
sword.
about it.
Yeah, in terms of the need of more research to establish in the field what would the information needed for an expert, and then in terms of training for an expert. So much to be done in this area. And I appreciate you doing a lot in this avenue. And thank you again so much, Dr. London, for all your expertise and all that you've shared with us and our audience.
My pleasure.
That concludes today's Law and Mental Health series. We will be happy to have you back again at a later time. Enjoy the rest of your day, everybody. Hope to see some of you next week when we talk to Dr. Johnny Pirelli on firearm assessments, guns, and mental health. And we will see you next week.
Thank you, everyone, for your time and for joining. I appreciate it.
Wonderful. And thanks so much again.
My pleasure.